Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'll introduce myself. I'm Bob Ritter. Actually, I think I know almost everyone here, so it's good to see you all. We're doing this little presentation today in conjunction with the Distinguished Cancer Lecture at noon by Dr. Norm Sharpless of the NCI. And what we really want to do is to overview cancer research funding in the US. That's a topic we all touch upon in different ways, but it's really hard to get into. And we actually, I think the three of us, Brittany, Annabelle, and I, had a really interesting time just sorting through some of this stuff. And we want to use a broad brush and give you some basics and also kind of generate some thinking. So it's an interesting topic, and I hope you enjoy it. And it's a small group, we're very informal, and you can pop questions in chat, and we'd love to hear from you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brittany to begin.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead. We have just like a few slides for visuals and things to show you. So let me get those up first. But hi everyone, my name is Brittany. I'm a 5th year PhD candidate in biomedical engineering, and I work in Claudia Fishbach's lab. So I'm gonna just get started with kind of like a little bit of an overview of the NIH and the NCI, or the National Cancer Institute, and then talk a little bit about how academic labs are funded and how kind of the grant process works. Yeah, and if anyone has any questions, there's not that many of us, so feel free, we can just have kind of an open conversation about everything. So just unmute yourself and ask the question at any time. Cool. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the total funding by the NIH and how much of that goes towards cancer-related research. So for this fiscal year, the NIH has a budget of around $41 billion. So there's a lot of money that gets thrown into healthcare research. About 16% of that goes to cancer. So this big pie chart on the slide here, this is all of the institutes that fall under the National Institutes of Health. So they fund research in all different areas of healthcare. And the one we're going to be talking about today is the National Cancer Institute. And they get, this year, they're expected to get about $6.5 billion worth of funding towards cancer research. So it is the largest of the institutes within the NIH. A couple of the other big ones I have highlighted here. So a lot goes to allergy and infectious disease, heart, lung, and blood, diabetes, digestive and kidney, neurological, and aging. And so even though this pie chart has a wedge specifically for the National Cancer Institute, there could also be some cancer-related research that happens in these other institutes that are organ specific. So what is the mission of the National Cancer Institute, or the NCI? What they're trying to accomplish is to lead and conduct and support research in cancer across the nation. Their main goal is to advance knowledge and improve the lives of people. So how does the National Cancer Institute end up with this sizable budget? It's actually given to the NCI through Congress. So this is going to be a budget line item in the federal budget. And then the NCI also receive funds from a couple of smaller sources. So one of those is royalty income, which is income that's generated based off of patents or discoveries that were made at the NCI. They do get some funding for sharing of equipment with different institutions and companies. And then they also receive a couple of $1 million through the sale of breast cancer stamps through the US Postal Service. So what does the NCI do with the $6 billion that they get this year? They spend it in a couple of different ways. The largest chunk of that goes towards research. And so that's going to be direct research that can either be done at the NCI, like in their facilities, or it's done by institutions and hospitals such as Cornell that's funded through grants. A smaller portion of the budget goes to resource development. So that's for things like cancer centers and equipment development. And then another portion of the budget goes to cancer prevention and control. And then about 10% goes to actually like program management and running the entire NCI. So the NCI funds research across a really broad area of cancer. So they do everything from basic science, causes and risk factors. They also do more clinically based things like prevention and detection, treatment. And then they also do work on survivorship research. So this is a breakdown of NCI funding by cancer type. So this isn't all of the cancers that the NCI funds. They fund all of the cancers, even rare cancers, but these are just the ones that receive the largest portion of the budget. So the one that you can see here that has the highest budget is breast cancer. This is partially due to the fact that breast cancer is the most commonly diagnosed cancer in women, but they receive a lot of the funding. But you can look here and see all of the other cancers and kind of their proportion of the overall budget. Okay, so now I want to talk about how academic labs, how funding works in academia. So I work in a research lab at Cornell, and how do we get the money to be able to function, and how do I get paid and things like that. So academic labs rely on grants, which a large portion of those grants come from the National Cancer Institute or the NIH as a whole, if you do healthcare research. And we use that money to be able to support the salaries of the graduate students. We use that to buy materials and things that we need for cell culture to actually conduct our research. We need that to purchase equipment that we need. And then we need it to actually, run all of our experiments, go to conferences, basically everything that we do, we need grants or else we wouldn't be able to do any of this research. What's interesting is that, so when my lab applies for a grant, they apply for a grant for a certain amount of money, you have to submit a budget. And that budget will cover things like student and postdoc salaries. It'll cover, reagents, everything we need for the experiments. And when we submit that grant, Cornell they have negotiated this percentage that they get from the NCI. So when we get a grant, Cornell also gets money. And what that does is that covers kind of the administrative costs of Cornell to be able to support our research lab. It also covers basically our rent, so our physical lab space and being able to keep the lights on, and for us to have offices and the physical laboratory to work with. And so that is money that's negotiated that's on top of the grant, but money that goes directly to the academic institution. So kind of one interesting thing that I wanted to tell you all about is the differences in how kind of funding works, especially if you are the principal investigator or the PI, which means you're the faculty member that runs the lab, and how that differs if you're located at a teaching university like we are here at Cornell's Ithaca campus, or if you're at a hospital or a cancer center doing research like Memorial Sloan Kettering. So this differs a little bit. So if you're a principal investigator at a teaching university, then your salary is going to be paid by the university for teaching. However, you still have a lot of pressure put on you and you're expected to get grants to be able to operate the lab. And you need this to get tenure and to stay a faculty member at that institution. It's a little bit different if you are a principal investigator at a hospital or a cancer center. So in that case, your salary depends on the grants that you get. So if you don't get any grants, then you're not getting paid. So the pay structure is a little bit different. And in that case, you really need to get those grants to pay not only your researchers and your lab and your equipment, but you also need that money to be able to pay yourself. And so because of this pay structure, there's a little bit of a difference in who is actually doing the hands-on lab work and also the goal of the research program. So if you're at a teaching university, then there's going to be a lot of graduate students like me who are doing the hands-on research, and there are some postdoctoral scholars. And so because we're students, we're still learning, we're not as efficient as a postdoc, so it takes us longer to learn the skills we need to be able to generate the data, which will then lead to publications and get new grants. So one of the major goals of the research programs at teaching universities is to be able to train the next generation of researchers and guide them in their scientific advancement. So this is a little bit different if you're at a hospital or a cancer center, most of the people that are going to be doing the research there are going to be postdoctoral scholars or research staff. And so they aren't still in the learning process, so they're able to more quickly generate data to publish papers and then get more grants to publish more papers. And that goal is more focused on scientific advancement. The next thing that we thought you all might be a little bit interested in hearing about is how do you get started as a new faculty member? So I mentioned how important it is to have grants because you need them to basically operate your entire lab. But what do you do when you're just starting out? So when you're a new faculty member at a university, you'll get what's called a startup package. And this is going to include basic money to get you started to purchase some equipment that you're going to need and funds to cover the first students. And so what you do is you take the startup money and you use this to start generating preliminary data so that you'll have that to be able to form a full hypothesis to write a grant and apply for a grant for. So grant funding is actually very competitive. So this is an example for a 5-year award that's through the National Cancer Institute. And so if you are an established investigator, you have to be at least in the top 11% of all applicants to get your grant funded. If you're a new investigator, so you're a new faculty member starting out, you get a little bit of a help and you have to be in the top 16% of all applications funded. But it is it's a very competitive process to get a grant. So this, is not great if you're a cancer researcher, but it's really great if you're the public or anyone trying to benefit from cancer research. Because it's so competitive, that means that only the very, very best research is going to get funded. And so it's really pushing everyone to do better and have these great research projects. So the last thing I just wanted to touch on is basically how the grant process works. So this process, it does take a while. It takes about 10 months from start to finish. And you start by the principal investigator is going to come up with an idea. The graduate students will help run preliminary experiments to generate this hypothesis. They write a grant proposal and prepare the budget. Then the university or your institute helps you submit the application. Next, it goes to a peer review process, which means that other scientists are going to look at and evaluate your work. And after it goes through that first round of reviews, they write up a summary and they send it to the National Cancer Advisory Board review, where they do a second review of all of the applications, and then it gets scored again. Then it finally gets sent to the NCI for program evaluation. They choose based on their priorities what grants they want to get funded. And then you get a final funding decision, and then your institution is going to help manage those funds and research can begin. But again, it's a pretty lengthy process and it takes about 10 months. So just one last piece of potentially interesting information for you all. The NCI does get royalties based off of inventions that happen on the NCI campus for those research. So basically, if you are working at the NCI and you develop a new drug or a new diagnostic tool or a new vaccine, then you're going to file for a patent on that. And then the NCI can get royalties based off of that patent if, for instance, a company goes on to produce and sell that product. So in 2019, they got about $85 million based off of the sale of those products. But that's kind of it for our summary of the NCI, and I'm going to turn it over to Bob to talk a little bit about nonprofits.
Okay, thank you, Brittany. This slide actually might be the most important one of all of them in terms of who funds it, who funds cancer research. If you look at the big bar on the left, that's funding from the National Cancer Institute. Look how that just sort of dominates just by many orders of magnitude. The second one is the Department of Defense that I'll talk about in a little bit. And after that are nonprofits that you're aware of, like the American Cancer Society, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, Stand Up to Cancer. It just gives you an idea of the magnitude of the importance of the NCI in funding cancer research in this country. It's just huge. Next, please. And we'll talk a little bit about the DoD, or Department of Defense funding. Next, please. It's also called the congressionally mandated, congressionally directed medical cancer research. You think, well, why is the Department of Defense funding cancer research, and why it's actually the #2 funder of cancer research? And it really happened in the early 90s in response to breast cancer advocates. They wanted more money flowing to breast cancer research. And the way that some people in Congress made that happen is to fund it through, or is to funnel it through the DoD. And the Department of Defense is a very important and good research infrastructure, so they can do this kind of work. And it's a way to for cancer, for the Congress to more directly control some of the cancer funding. Next, please. But they don't fund. A couple things to mention. They really focus on what they call high risk, high reward initiatives to really encourage researchers to try something new and to think outside the box. And secondly, they were the first group to really involve consumers or patient advocates throughout the review process. And I've been in several of those reviews. Monica Pekiner from Ithaca has been in several of them. It's a very good process. Next, please. And again, they don't fund every cancer, they fund select cancers. And this shows you the current funding levels for different types of cancer. And #1, like the NCI, is breast cancer, and about $150 million this year. And then prostate, kidney, ovarian, peer-reviewed cancer is a little bit more generic, but this gives you an idea of what's funded through this mechanism. And one thing to note about breast cancer is, as Brittany mentioned, it's the leading cancer in women, but also people with breast cancer tend to do well. So there are lots of survivors, and they have become very good advocates. So that's why breast cancer has really been at the forefront of a lot of advocacy movements. Next, please. And this shows you, looks at some of the biggest nonprofits, like cancer nonprofits, and how much they fund in sort of in absolute dollars. And as not surprisingly, the American Cancer Society is the largest and funds about $150 million each year. And then leukemia and lymphoma is more focused. Stand Up to Cancer, you see a lot more recently, where they have annual telethons. PanCan is a pancreatic cancer group. Multiple myeloma. MetaViver, I'll talk about more, is a small group designed to raise money strictly for metastatic breast cancer research. So this is the chart of absolute dollars. And next, please. And this shows you, for these same nonprofits, how much of their budget goes to research. And for the American Cancer Society, it's roughly 18%. Leukemia, lymphoma, 12%. Surprisingly, Stand Up to Cancer is only about 10%. They raise a lot of money, but only a small portion goes to research. That doesn't mean that that's necessarily bad. My belief is that as long as nonprofits are very transparent in terms of what they fund and what their mission is, it can make sense. PanCan and multiple myeloma give roughly half their funds for research. And also, I mentioned MetaViver before, and that's a relatively small new group, but it was organized by women and men with metastatic breast cancer, and they pledged essentially to give all of their money to research for metastatic breast cancer advancement. And as you can see here, they give roughly 95% of everything that they receive goes directly to cancer research, which is very impressive. Next, please. I want to give a few case studies of interest in the nonprofit world. Next, please. What is the National Breast Cancer Coalition, which is based in DC, began in the early 90s? Next, please. Their annual budget is really pretty small, about $3 million, but they were the group that really got the breast cancer funding through the Department of Defense. So in a sense, their $3 million budget leverages about $150 million in breast cancer research, which is phenomenal. So that's been a very effective group in promoting cancer research. Next, please. Lance Armstrong, LiveStrong. A lot of you know the name of Lance Armstrong. He was the world's best cyclist for many years. He was a big name, and for a while, his foundation was one of the largest ones in cancer in the U.S. And you might note these logos on the left, Lance Armstrong. In the middle, you have the Lance Armstrong and the LiveStrong. You know, you're sort of fading a little bit from Lance Armstrong, and then on the right, the most recent incarnation, you just see LiveStrong and no Lance Armstrong. And next slide, please. And this gives you an idea of their fundraising through the years. As I mentioned, back in 2011, it was about a $50 million organization, which is very, very large. And suddenly you see their revenue, what their donations dropped dramatically. And then down in 2014, it was about $8 million and even less. Actually, 2018 looks blank, but there actually was a little bit of money there. So there was actually some money there. So that's an accurate representation. And the next slide kind of shows why. The rise and fall of Lance Armstrong. Like I said, he had testicular cancer, and he had a remarkable story where he had advanced cancer. It had gone to his brain and lungs. He was very, very ill, but he sort of bounced back, had remarkable recovery, went back to the Olympics, won lots of awards. But then, you know, around 2012, it became open knowledge that he was doping. He was stripped of all of his awards. He was also not a very nice person. If you read some of the biographies about him, he was really mean and hostile to his teammates because he wanted them to keep his secrets, and it was a big mess. But basically, that organization was founded and was carried on his name. When his name was sullied, the foundation kind of tanked. And that's one danger in linking a nonprofit to one person, because bad things can really happen. Next slide, please. Also want to mention Susan G. Komen, a very, very large breast cancer foundation. Next slide, please. This shows their size through the years, their fundraising basically. And at one point, it was over $200 million, which is huge. It rivaled the American Cancer Society, and it was that kind of scope. But then after 2010, 2011, you see it going down pretty dramatically and cut by more than half. And next, please. And that was really political, because at one point, Susan G. Komen they made a point of funding lots of mammography and screening for breast cancer. But at one point in time, they decided it was a very conservative organization, and they decided not to give any money to cancer screening that was based at Planned Parenthood. So they announced that. There's a big backlash from lots of women. You see some of the signs on the right, and it it's really shaken them, and it's really affected their fundraising and their ability to do work. And next, please. And finally, I just wanted to mention the Breast Cancer Coalition of Rochester, which is a regional organization, just not too far away from here. Next, please. And I think they've done a really good job. Although it's a relatively small organization, their total budget is maybe $1 million, but they give out each year money for breast cancer research. One is for pre or postdoctoral fellowship of $25,000, and also a $50,000 faculty fellowship. And they've given roughly $1 million in upstate New York for breast cancer research. And I think it's a really good example of an organization giving relatively small grants, but they're very targeted, and it's been very effective in improving visibility, in terms of getting their membership involved in research. I think it's a very good example of smart funding of research from a small organization. So I think that's my last slide. Next, please. Yes, and now, Annabella, turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. I'm actually going to steal the screen from you. Hope that's all right.
Sure.
Alrighty, so we've been analyzing this question. Oh, can everybody see my slides?
Yes.
Lovely, thank you. Alrighty, so we've been analyzing this question of who funds cancer research from a variety of facets. So first looking at academia, which has the primary goal of to teach and to create the next generation of scientists. Second is government, which is really to serve the public interest, and industry, which is to generate revenue. And so industry in general, their primary goal, well, is to make a lot of money. And how do they start out with that money? Well, historically, the majority of a pharmaceutical company's revenue comes from a pattern of steadily increasing prices of drugs that have been on the market for some time. And so for larger, more established companies like the Genentechs and the Roches of the world, this makes a lot of sense. They already have drugs out on the market. They already have monopoly over the patents for those given pharmaceuticals. However, what about those smaller companies that might not have that backing of that sort? And that's where two other facets come in. So there's angel investors and venture capital. So what angel investors are they're individuals often with a vested interest in what the company is, what innovative pharmaceutical a company is proposing, and it's usually a personal relationship. And what they do is they invest a significant amount at the very onset of the pharmaceutical company's creation, and in doing so they ask for some equity, which is ownership or say in the company's directions in the future. So what the company gets is a really nice sum of money, and what the investor gets is a piece of the pie of something that they really believe in. Kind of in a similar vein with venture capital, you're seeing a very similar relationship where however, it's usually a group of investors, and companies usually pitch to VC firms, venture capital VC firms, in order to get that initial funding. And so, yeah, so they're pitching to a group. It's less of a personal relationship, and the investors still walk away with a piece of the pie with whatever the organization winds up creating. So let's put a face to the name. So a lot of these are pretty familiar, but what we have here are the top 10 companies that produce and study the most oncology drugs in the world. Quite a few names are familiar here, but you're going to zone in on, pardon me. So yes, the industrial side of cancer research often gets a bad rap, and industry in general often gets a bad rap because of the fact that they get a lot of their money from the sales of the drugs that they create. But why is that the case? And so we're going to do a little case study of something that happened with Eli Lilly a while back. So a little bit about Eli Lilly. It was founded in 1875. Its net sales was about $24 million, and 25% of that of that money was put towards research and development, which is pretty standard, and they spent about $6,000. About oh yes. So pardon me. They spent about 25% of that towards R&D, and some of the oncology drugs that they have currently out on the market is Alimita and Cyramza. Alimita is often used in conjecture with platinum-based chemotherapy, in addition to Keytruda, which is an immunotherapy drug that disrupts the PD-1 PD-L1 interaction. And so in 2019, Eli Lilly got in a bit of a pickle, and it received a lot of public scrutiny, as shown through this billboard. So there was a movement called Milking Cancer, and many people were upset with Eli Lilly because let's see. So this is a direct quote from the Milking Cancer campaign, and it says, Eli Lilly is now the sole manufacturer of RBGH, the artificial growth hormone that given to dairy cows that increases people's risk of cancer. They also manufacture breast cancer treatment. So in seeing a billboard like this and analyzing the statement, I decided to analyze each claim in this and see what's going on. So first of all, back in 2008, Eli Lilly bought the patent for recombinant growth bovine serum, which is a hormonal treatment used in dairy cows in order to increase their milk production. So yes, they purchased this from Monsanto for $300, and the way that they explained this was that they wanted to help developing countries they wanted to help developing countries and like have more milk production, basically. The second claim here that checks out is that this artificial growth hormone given to dairy cows is not super great for the cows, first of all, and second of all, it does increase milk production in cows. However, the last and arguably most important claim in this quote is that it increases people's risk of cancer, and that's one that did not check out. So I looked at a variety of sources where labs with no conflicts of interest with Eli Lilly investigated this claim, and there is no withstanding evidence that drinking milk produced using this hormone, this synthetic hormone, increases IGF-1 levels in humans or adds to the risk of developing cancer. So IGF-1 is a growth factor that emulates insulin, but for this context, there are two reasons that underlie why there's really no correlation here. First, hormones are extremely specific to whatever their environment they're in and whatever role they're meant to play. And because of that, this RBGH cannot play the same role in a cow as it does in humans. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that the elevated IGF-1 levels seen in individuals who consume milk from cows is also seen in humans consuming milk alternatives, including soy milk. And so because of that, that leads to this last part of this claim being rather unfounded. However, in looking at this whole picture and in looking at this, this required a lot of digging on my part and a lot of scientific investigation on the back end. However, in seeing something like this and of learning of purchases of this way, it is very easy to take a different perspective on what is happening, and pretty much it makes sense that companies that operate in this way, that have such a perspective, a money-driven perspective on something as personal as cancer and cancer treatment, has a bad rap in society in general. So at this point in time, I want to open up the floor for discussion in case anybody has any questions or anything they want to talk about. And yes, that's pretty much it. Thank you.